Welcome, everybody, once again. Um, Lauren Hood is a notorious, wonderful AfroUrbanist from Detroit. We are so excited to have her with us tonight. Many of you, if you are familiar with the Detroit design industry, there's no chance that you have not heard her name before. So we are really excited to be able to have her here tonight to explain to us exactly what AfroUrbanism and reparations is. She really wants this to be an interactive presentation. So if you have a question for Lauren throughout the presentation, we really encourage you to enter it into the chat. Use the chat box as a way of interacting with other attendees, sending praise Lauren's way. Whatever you feel is necessary in the moment. And Patty and I will be looking out for those questions that are relevant to the presentation while it's going on. And then at the end of Lauren's presentation, we have some questions that were submitted through the Eventbrite RSVP process. So thank you so much for the people who submitted those questions. We're going to use those to kick off the Q&A at the end of the presentation. And what we would love for people to do at that point is to use the raise hand feature, which is in the panel participant panel discussion. And we will unmute you and allow you to actively discuss your question with Lauren at that time. We'll revisit those rules once we get to that portion, but I wanted to give everyone a heads up that there will be opportunities for you all to participate in this discussion live with Lauren Hood. Now, I think I have said enough to get things started, so I am going to pass the mic to Lauren Hood. Welcome, Lauren. Thank you.
Thank you, other Lauren. I struggle with public presentations anyway, but what I love about it is when I can see people's faces and I can kind of connect, but now I can see no one and only my screen. Oh, there we go. Hey, Nahaya, Michael. Okay, cool. That's helpful. Thanks, everybody. So I want to talk to you today about a new approach. And I'm not coming necessarily with answers, but I think this new approach will create processes where we can come up with answers together in cohort with citizens. People are always like, well, what's a case study? What's an example? Give me an example. And I don't think there are necessarily answers out there, but there's a process that can get us to asking better questions and getting us to, different kinds of results. I always start presentations with talking about my identities, and in particular, my conflicting identities. So I have a lot of insider roles that I play. I'm an educated person. I am trained in the disciplines of community development. I'm a paid practitioner in this work. I'm an appointee to our planning commission. So all of those roles have a lot of insider access. I play a thought leader role. People ask my opinions a lot. There's a whole insider kind of thing that's going on with those identities. But there's also the outsider in me. I'm still a Black person Black people are typically left out of planning decisions at the highest level. I'm a woman. There aren't a lot of women planners, architects, urban designers, and Native Detroiters are often left out of this planning too in these processes. So these are always at conflict with each other. There's the bougie insider in me loves new restaurants and loves new shops and can participate and, oh, how lovely, look how the city's coming back. But then the Black Native Detroiter in me is like, everybody can participate in that. That's some whack shit. So these are always at odds with each other. And I have to just acknowledge that those are always functioning in the background when I'm making decisions, when I'm analyzing the value of something, is those two personalities are always going at it. And I think that it's something we don't think about enough. Who you are as a person and how you identify really guides your approach, the way you view things, your value system, and we don't think about it enough when we're coming to the table with folks that might be different than us. So here are some current practices. We've got urbanism, and then there was new urbanism, and then there's human-centered design, and most recently it's like equitable development. And I think all of these kind of fall short. They do a little bit of something, but they really focus on a lot of the built environment and economics, but not like the social good, like how are people being whole or complete. They're really just built environment kind of approaches and economic kind of approaches. So I've always been wondering, like, what else is there? How might we incorporate things like race and culture into our approaches around community development, in particular when we're doing work in communities of color? How can you do work in a Black community and not address what Black means, how Black people communicate, how Black people celebrate, what Black people value? It's just never at the center of what we're doing, and it doesn't apply in any of these approaches. So it just got me thinking. And then there's this moment in time where we've had this massive worldwide racial event. Like, is this a moment where we can be more bold, where we can say things like reparations, where we can talk about race, where we can insert race into the conversation around community development? I think now is the time where we can do that. And what's interesting about this moment, like, Black folks have always known that Black lives matter and Black opinions matter and Black values matter. But right now is a time where everybody is starting to recognize it. So the veil has been lifted. White people, Asian people, Native American people, people who haven't before been a part of like the Black Lives Matter movement are now saying, yes, we agree, we see you, Black Lives Matter. So what does that mean for the planning and development disciplines? On the side, I also do a lot of racial justice consulting, and the cadre of companies that have reached out wanting some kind of training. So they're like restaurant groups, automotive corporations, churches, everybody's reevaluating how they practice with this new racial lens. So can we look at urban planning and development with our new racial lens? What does that look like? And like I said, Black people have always known that those old approaches weren't really working out, but now it seems like everybody's kind of getting wind from that. So there's this kind of woke white woman writer at Curbed who's been, you know, exploring like, hey, maybe these approaches that we've been using for a long time haven't really been serving everybody equally. So questioning things like, has urbanism worked for people? Asking deeper questions like how to end anti-Blackness in cities. So I think that equitable development, it's a good starting point to talk about what we need to be doing in communities, but you can't just stop at like equity. If you can't say Blackness, if we can't be pro-Black in what we're doing, it's really not going to get at the solutions that we need. So we can't be afraid to say things like Black. So that leads us to AfroUrbanism. So can we, in a moment like this, where we're questioning with this new racial awareness that we all have, the approaches that we're using, can we add Afro into the mix? So AfroUrbanism centers the lived experience of Black people in the design and creation of Black communities. It doesn't seem like it should be that revolutionary, but think about if you've worked on a project in a Black neighborhood, who is doing all the talking? Like, I'm on a consultant team right now where we're doing a planning process with some East Side neighborhoods. And if you look at all the talking heads, like, it's all white folks all the time, usually the white men on the consultant team. I'm the only person of color on our consultant team in a neighborhood that is 90% Black. And those dynamics are not rare. So at what point can we really be centering the voices of Black folks, the opinions of Black folks? AfroUrbanism will put Black culture at the forefront, taking into account past harms, which we usually don't do. We're not thinking about the racial history of places when we're dealing with them. We always address current challenges, so that's nothing new, but also considering future aspirations. I think lots of times when you ask people what they want for their community, they're addressing what's before them. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people talk about trash pickup or lights on, but what about future aspirations? Clearly you want a community that allows you to live a better life than just having the basics of trash picked up and lights on. And how do we have those kinds of conversations with people to create better futures? So just some guiding principles that I've always worked with in doing community work. What I find is the technicians on the team, like the engineers, sometimes the architects, people are really strict in listening to the client. The client could be the city, like the municipality that contracted the work. It could be a developer that's doing a project. And they have a really hard time deciphering whose needs are more important. I always think the community is the client, no matter who's paying for it, whether the city put you up to it or a developer, the people that are going to be most impacted by the work you're doing are your real client. And I feel like if you can satisfy the needs of the community that you're working in, whoever your client is will be happy. But I find that the technical folks have such a hard time listening to community and prioritizing that because they're worried that the client will be mad. The client will be fine. Just do what the community needs. I think scope creep should also be encouraged. Again, it is those technical folks that are like, oh, racial equity isn't in the scope. Really? So we can't address it because it's not on the piece of paper. How do we also think about the other emergent issues? So I'm showing projects I've worked on because I'm okay criticizing my work. Sometimes people that I do the work with don't like that. So I'm trying to just take ownership of where my stuff is falling short. But this was in conjunction with some other folks, but I'm just criticizing, my contributions here. So I ran a community development organization on the Northwest side, and a lot of the funding that we had for that organization was put into built environment interventions. And there was this park in the Fitzgerald neighborhood that was really celebrated. I think it even got a landscape architecture award. And the park is fine, but folks would always ask me, well, what about that vacant house next door? So in this picture, you see the beautiful park and the streetscape, lovely. But on the other side of this house are 3 other vacant houses. So if you've ever lived on the street with vacant houses, if you know like what that makes you feel about your neighborhood, like it's scary. As a woman, people get assaulted in vacant houses. People deal drugs in vacant houses. Like vacant houses are dangerous. So if you can think about, how can the work that you're doing in the community speak to what is directly asked of you, like working on this public infrastructure, but also can you connect people to different kinds of organizations that might help them work on things like the vacant houses? Can you provide people with different resources that might get them to own one of these houses where they can fix them up themselves? Like what can you as a planner, urban designer, architect bring to the table beyond the scope that can help address these emergent issues? Because you can't act like you don't see them. It's inefficient. I feel like planners and developers should have some kind of Hippocratic oath in the way that doctors do. Like you treat everything that's wrong with a person. How can we come into a community and just treat the one thing that's on the piece of paper when you see that other things are wrong? So be open to doing what's outside of this stated scope. Place-based expertise more valuable than professional experience. This woman in the picture here, Miss Maggie Lee, been in the neighborhood some 40, 50 years. She knows where all the bodies are buried, who killed them, what it was about. She knows what works, what doesn't work in the community. Every place that you're doing work in has a person like this. You should get to know them. You should listen to their experiences and don't invite them to the table just to give you feedback on the thing that you've designed. Just have open-ended conversations with people about their lives, about their futures, and you will get at the information you need for your project. But be open to having meaningful conversations with people and understand that the know-how that we bring to the table, like we went to school, got a little master's degree in architecture, community development. And yes, that academic expertise is important. But if you're working in a place where there are people who have been there several generations, they also have valuable knowledge to contribute. And it's more valuable than what you have to bring to the table in a lot of cases. In particular, when you're doing place-based work, that place-based expertise should be at the top of the expertise pyramid. So what we're bringing at the most is complementary, but it shouldn't be seen as superior. Relationships over real estate. So much of the work that we do in community development is about the built environment. You're going to hear me say that many times in a bunch of different ways. But what I would argue in communities of color, relationships are the most important thing. Relationships are the difference between you having a ride to work when you need it, having somebody look at your house when you're away. There are all these things that can't happen that are good in your community unless you're in right relationship with the people that are in that community with you. So again, that work I was doing on the Northwest side, I felt like my role was to serve as convener. So there's a university that partnered with me leading that organization that had a really fractured relationship with the folks in the community for a lot of different reasons that'll come up again later. But I felt like it was my role to just convene the conversations and create platforms for people to say the things they had wanted to say to that institution, but didn't really have an outlet for it. So I'm always convening conversations. Process over product. Again, the technicians really like to focus on what your outcome is. You're like, oh my God, the plan, the design, the blueprint, whatever the tangible takeaway is. But it's my contention that if you design a better process, you'll get better outcomes. People in Black communities have been taken advantage of, promised things that never matriculated, had our voices suppressed. There are all these ways in which we can improve processes to get to that better product, but don't prioritize whatever the outcome is. Prioritize making a good ass process so that you can have that good product. And one of the tools that I always use for good process is, again, storytelling. So just talking to people about what their experiences are, letting people know that their experiences are valued. I can't tell you how many times I heard from people like, well, my story isn't really valuable. My experience isn't valuable. Who cares, you know, what I do day to day here? I'm like, no, but it is. This whole thing is for you. It's all for you. But we don't really create platforms for people to to talk to us about things that they think are important. I think sometimes in community engagement, when we don't get the kind of input we want, we kind of blame people and think that they're apathetic, but it's really because we're asking the wrong questions. We're talking about things that people don't care about. Nobody cares like the aesthetics of the street light, or, you know, or what how much green space is in between the street and the sidewalk. People want to have real conversations about the kind of futures they want. And if you can glean from those kind of conversations things that you can apply to the built environment, that is the highest and best that we can do. Culture over commerce. I think if you don't have a cultural conversation, you really can't understand what the right commercial application is. Any planning process I've worked on, and there's been a few now, the conversation we're always having with community members is, what kind of business do you want in that storefront? Like, how sad of a conversation is that? Why are we always starting with the commerce piece, especially in a time where people are underemployed, unemployed, financially insecure? We're still starting conversations about vacant storefronts with like what kind of business goes in the space. We had the best conversation, again, this East Side plan I'm working on, where we were asking people, what other kinds of uses can you see in a space? And one of the guys said, I would like a racial justice center in my neighborhood. Like, he's a pastor, and one of the things that people reported was problematic for them was the way that people of different races don't get along. There's a lot of Black people that have been there a long time. Lots of white folks are moving into the neighborhood. So when we talked about problems in the neighborhood, people were like, a little bit of racial tension. And this guy was like, I would like a racial justice center. And it's something that, you know, it's not in our scope to provide those kind of things, because really this planning process is being funded by a lender who needs commercial activity to take place. But again, we know that these are emergent needs that need to be addressed. So I'm still thinking about how we can get this guy a racial justice center, although my colleagues on the team are like, okay, back to business. What kind of restaurant do folks want? But thinking about what kind of organization can I connect this guy with that can help him get this thing that he thinks will make his experience in the neighborhood better. So always thinking about what the culture is of the place instead of starting with that commerce question, especially at a time when people are so financially insecure. And I'll talk about what's in this image a little bit. This guy here is a poet in the neighborhood. I was asking him, you know, tell me about your experience in the neighborhood. His family had been in the neighborhood for like 40, 50 years. He's a spoken word guy. He talked about, he's like, you know, that laundromat on the corner used to be a coffee house. I'm like, really? When was this? So it turns out this, what is now a laundromat at Livernois and 6 Mile, used to be like this beat poet hangout called the Chessmate. People like Joni Mitchell played there. Like, you would never know this unless this guy had told you the story about the place and his experience in it. So we made up a temporary historic marker. We took some folks on a walking tour and got to talk about what had happened in this historic place, and got to create a platform for a longtime resident to kind of take the mic. Transformation over intervention. I think that I'm going to blame philanthropy. We're really encouraged to do things that are interventions that don't really have any kind of long-term staying power. Always looking for that quick demonstration of, look, we're doing something. Here's a picture, something we can put in our financial end of year report. But I'm finding that it kind of like limits our thinking about what is possible. We're put into this place where we have to do something that's quick and fast and fits into the budget, but might not have any kind of long-term staying power. And again, this is some stuff I participated in. This was a farmer's market because everybody does a farmer's market. put like 10 grand into like getting these picnic tables, buying these tents for people, hiring entertainment. Let me tell you one thing, people in these communities don't need parties. They don't need picnics. They do that better than we can from the outside, I guarantee. But, you know, at the time, I didn't know any better. It's like, yeah, we should have a farmer's market. It'll create some, you know, economic opportunity for different vendors. But it really, like, we didn't think about what happens after this farmer's market. Like, is there some opportunity for these vendors to get into a long-term retail situation somewhere? Are they on a path to like a storefront? And also when I look at this, I see like the high school cafeteria. What I know about this picture is like, I know all the people in it, and the people from the adjacent university are at some tables and the people from the community are at different tables. That in my mind is not a successful event. We didn't do anything to address the barriers that were causing all the problems in this neighborhood. Like on the surface, it looks like a great event, like 300 people showed up that day. But upon deeper analysis, it's like, what is the long-term transformative impact of what we did? And I would say not much. So I also want to introduce the term reparations. What occurred to me is people are using the word reparations right now. You know, it's a bold moment where we can say things like that. Some of us have always been thinking it, but now we can actually say it. At the root of the word was repair. I'm like, I wonder if there's some principles that you can apply that could speak to each of the letters in repair so that it kind of sticks in people's mind what they need to thinking about when approaching community work and righting wrongs. So yes, as it turns out, there are. So reckoning with the history, what is interesting to me is that I have a lot of colleagues working in planning and development who don't know the racial history of Black neighborhoods. How can you do work in a Black neighborhood and not understand how the Federal Housing Authority, the Federal Highway Act, redlining, restrictive covenants, how can you come into a Black community and not understand how these things have had an impact on what we see today? And I think that it helps my understanding why some of my colleagues think that, again, that folks in communities are apathetic or lazy or ask questions like, why is everybody so angry? How can you know this history and not understand why people are angry? So it just occurred to me, they don't know the history. So at this point, I guess I have to blame the academy. How are these schools graduating planners and architects without teaching this history, which is at the root of why the communities look like they do? So sometimes you kind of need a white person and an academic to talk to you about stuff in order to take it seriously. So there's this professor, Robert Godspeed at the Taubman School at U of M, who summed it up this way. This is what he said about urban renewal in the 60s that I think is directly applicable to what is happening today. But tens of thousands of poor and mostly Black citizens were dislocated in the name of civic progress, saw their homes, businesses, and communities appraised, bought, and destroyed without their input or permission. So again, he was saying this about the 1960s, but it could easily be translated into what is happening today. So when we think about that first R, that reckoning, a case study I'd like to investigate is what would a reckoning look like for the Black Bottom neighborhood in Detroit? So everything I heard about Black Bottom growing up was that, you know, what the buildings looked like, they were in disrepair and there was trash in the streets and, oh, people were living so horribly and we had to remove the blight. So we just think about urban renewal in the context of blight clearance. But what it also got rid of was what you see over here, the 423 residents, 151 physicians, social workers, lawyers, beauty shops, restaurants, dentists, drugstores. So when you think about it in the context of what gets removed in blight clearance or slum clearance, as it was referred to, you can have a better understanding of where people are at. So my mom spent her childhood in the Black Bottom neighborhood. There are people alive today who were here and experienced this loss. So when you're coming into a community and you don't have that knowledge and you can't reckon with the history, you're doing yourself and the people there a disservice. Again, what reckoning has looked like in my work was just convening conversations, all manner of conversations. So in the upper right-hand corner, there's the president of the university that my org was partnered with, talking to Maggie Lee, longtime resident. And I think that when I look back on this work and I think about what are my my successes, my wins, is that those relationships were created. So people that have lived in the neighborhood for a long time who didn't have access to the administration at this university that was like planted in their community. So one thing I did was create platforms for those people to get to know the leadership at that university. So that is one of my what I view as a success, but creating all manner of ways for people to interact. So panel discussions where people from the neighborhood would be the panelists, get on the stage and just share their story and have their neighbors listen. Convening small groups of people from the university with people in the neighborhood. We had an event that we called Storefront Stories, where we activated a vacant storefront, put people at tables with people they didn't know and gave them some prompting questions to kind of start a conversation about what kept them in the community and what they wanted to see for its future. So any excuse that you can make for people to talk to each other is how a reckoning begins. It's all about that relationship, but you have to understand that history. Empowering people. So I have a mentor that doesn't like to say that those of us doing this work can empower people, but what you can do is create conditions for people to empower themselves. I know myself to be kind of a gatekeeper, so I occupy or straddle these two worlds, that insider, outsider, that privilege, no privilege kind of world. So I am often asked to speak for entire groups of people, communities of people, races of people. And sometimes I get tempted and I just do it. But in my conscious mind, I'm like, wait a minute, what are you doing? You don't have to talk all the time. So just create platforms for people to speak and advocate for themselves to the extent that you can. So this again was another one of the, I used to call the event the Speak Easy, where people could speak easily about what was going on in their community. But we convened a bunch of leaders from the university who had to sit and listen to people from the community talk to them about themselves. And why is it that revitalization always occurs at the cost of culture? Why do we have to lose our flavor as things start to develop? That P in repair is going to be preserving the culture. And one of my favorite preserving the culture stories is the go-go music in DC. So there was a phone store that used to play go-go music in this Black neighborhood. So the people there, that was the culture of the place, this go-go music. For those of you that don't know go-go music, actually the only band I know would be who made Doing the Butt. Whatever that band was, that song Doing the Butt was an example of go-go music. So go-go music is kind of like the quintal DC music. This phone store was playing the music for years and years and years, and people loved it. But then little Sally Gentrifier moved into the neighborhood and was like, the music's too loud. So then they called corporate Metro PCS and the people stopped playing the music. But then the community responded in such a way. There was like a Don't Mute DC campaign. There was like a rally. There was a big go-go music parade. So all these things happened where the community kind of fought back and was like, nuh-uh, you're not taking away our go-go music. So what that led to was the mayor making a declaration that go-go music was the official music of DC. The music is back on at the Metro PCS, but this quote that was in this article is one of the most important things. So, and it can be applied to how culture is so important to any development work, but we don't really look at it that way. So when people come here, they don't know DC. They don't know our culture. It's that ignorance that causes people to disrespect our culture. So if we make it law, if we protect it, they'll start to understand. So to what extent can we in our work protect and preserve the culture that is there? So even if you go to a place and go-go music isn't your thing, you need to investigate what is the thing for the people that are there. Asset framing. So often when we're talking about Black communities, we start at a deficit point: underserved, underprivileged, marginalized, blighted, always addressing it from the negative standpoint. And those adjectives might be true in describing a certain set of conditions in a Black neighborhood, but what would happen if we started with the assets of a community? So one of my favorite places, and sometimes I worry about giving this information to the world because I feel like it's such a sacred place where sacred things are happening, but it's also such a great case study. So I have some trepidation in sharing, but it's so good. So the North End neighborhood in Detroit, which is kind of like the terminal neighborhood for our Q-Choo train. So there's a lot of outside interest in the neighborhood right now and a lot of gentrification could happen. However, it's a very organized neighborhood. So if I was looking at the assets of the place, that would be one. It would be the way that the people are networked. It's all people that have lived there a long time. This one picture on the left is my friend Halima. Her family has been in the neighborhood for 3 generations. And although it looks like a picture, it's actually a mural on the side of like a 13-story building. So, and this is a development done by the platform, and they're along on their work journey. They haven't really arrived yet, but I will give them credit for this initiative right here. Because again, Halima's family has been in the neighborhood for 3 generations. She's like my contemporary. She's a woman who's in her 40s. Normally we like memorialize people. We put dead folks on buildings, but it's like a living, breathing monument of a person who matters to the community. And then so Underground Resistance, like this internationally renowned electronic music label, is also in the North End. But if you didn't know your homework, you wouldn't know about it. It's in a very nondescript building on the boulevard. You really have to get to know people to know that that's there and to understand the value that that place has for the community. Same thing with Can Bookstore, kind of new. But it's kind of a revolutionary bookstore. People rally around it, the kind of events that they have, speak to folks in the community and kind of get people riled up and knowledgeable about what's going on. And then my friend Bryce with his hood closed to gentrifier sweatshirt. He's such an amazing force of nature. Can we view humans in these communities as assets? I think we're naturally drawn when we're doing asset maps to be like, oh, the school, the church, this retail establishment. But what if we started to look at people in the community and the networks they have between each other as an asset? Like if you leverage that network in the right way, you can make like amazing change, even more so than anything that could happen in any one of those buildings. And also there's a Black-owned food co-op in the neighborhood. So how does this network of kind of grassroots community activists and artists and creatives, like how can this asset network do something to help create the neighborhoods of the future instead of the traditional assets that we're looking for, and framing it starting with assets instead of the deficits? Activate the imagination. I think I mentioned earlier, lots of times in conversations with community members, they're addressing basic needs that are in front of them right now. Maybe it's crime, maybe it's trash, maybe it's lights. But what are we doing to plan for the communities of the future? I am really interested in what could it look like if you incorporate elements of Afrofuturism into community development. It's such a good tool at expanding people's ideas about what is possible. And I know that there are a couple of planning schools that have even made like a Wakanda curriculum based on, this is a Wakanda picture, that actually have a curriculum around, you know, the Black imagination and Black futures. Like, what does it look like to have these kind of conversations with people that, instead of those random ass like trash and lighting questions? Like, what is possible when you tap into people's imagination? And again, this is a billboard that a friend of mine curated here. And it seems like a pretty basic concept. Like, of course, there are Black people in the future, but it really stimulated a lot of interesting conversation. Like, what are we doing in the future? What is our social position in the future as we are in a mostly Black city and we're kind of second-class citizens? So if you can think about ways to just stimulate people's imagination around what is possible, I think you can get to some amazing outcomes, the likes of which that we can't even conceive right now because we're still having these very elementary questions about what we should do in community. But can we talk futures? And lastly, restoring the spirit or swagger. This is a picture of some folks in Black Bottom. I led the folks on the community advisory in this East Side project we're working on through a visioning session, and asked people of all the places in the world that you've either been or wanted to go to, what was your favorite and why? And the first woman that responded, Miss Beverly, said Black Bottom. So if you remember, all these negative things are said about the way the buildings look and how the streets are kept, and oh, urban renewal, it had to go away. And I was like, well, what was it about Black Bottom that made that your choice? And she was like, oh, the music, the food, the culture, the way people carried themselves. So can you imagine if we invested in people's spirit, the restoration of people's spirit, making people whole in the way that we do into buildings and development projects and park projects. What if we took some of that money and actually invested it in people? How might those outcomes be different? And how might communities look different if you could restore people's sense of swagger?
Well, thank you, Lauren, for that presentation. I know that I will likely be getting requests after tonight if that presentation can be made available. Are you willing to share that with the attendees
Of
of
course.
this evening? All right, wonderful. Well, with that being said, I think we should probably kick it off to some questions. One of the questions that you and I sort of talked about before this evening that we thought would be a good way to start is if the goal is to truly see humans as equal and race as a non-issue, why should we as designers aspire to delineate design for Black communities differently than for everyone else?
Yes, I'm so glad that question was posed. I think what that points out to me when I hear that, I hear, well, if all the races matter, why are we focusing on Black Lives Matter? And it's interesting that you have to ask a question like this in terms of a Black community. Like, why is it a question to prioritize the needs and wants and lived experiences of Black people in communities that are overwhelmingly Black? I don't think that it is a zero-sum game. I think people look at it like, well, if we have more equitable outcomes for Black people, then white folks have to give something up. And that isn't the case. It's not zero-sum. And it's not like, well, if Black people get more leadership roles and more of their voice in the conversation, then white folks then have to be subjugated. That also is not the case. There is room and space for everyone in the conversation. And I believe that there is a certain kind of alchemy that can only take place when everybody's voice is heard and everybody's opinion is valued at the same level. There are outcomes that we can't even conceive of yet because we haven't really had conversations where everybody shows up whole.
Well, thank you for that answer, Lauren. And again, to the attendees, this is a great time. If Lauren's presentation inspired some questions, please feel free to type them into the chat. Or if you want to raise your hand in the participant panel, not necessarily like in your camera, but like in the participant panel, there, right next to your name or at the bottom of the participant panel, there's the ability to raise your hand and we'll see it and we'll allow you to unmute yourself. While people are maybe thinking about other questions, I can keep going with the ones that were submitted before this evening. So, Lauren, what do you think is the most common misconception about Black communities, and which misconception do you think has the most adverse effect on Black communities?
Well, the worst misconceptions I think are those deficit framed ones. I think when you go into a community expecting that, there's nothing there, people don't care, that people somehow contributed to the way that the communities look like they do. If you remember the history, you know that it is not our fault that our communities look the way that they do. Our communities have been disinvested in. They've been extracted from. So there are reasons why the communities look like they do that I think that outsiders don't take into consideration. So I think that those are the biggest misconceptions, that it's our fault. And I think some of us, some Black folks, we embody those opinions as well. If you've been told that long enough that this is your fault, you start to believe that too. I myself I'm doing my own deprogramming because I bought into that for a long time because that's all I heard. So for me, this is all kind of a learning process, and me finding my way back to the culture is finally understanding, like, no, those were lies. There are reasons that it looks like they do, and it's not our fault. So it's not just outsiders that embody those ideas about us, it's us too.
And we're finally getting some questions through the chat. Thank you, everyone. From Ellen, can we ask a bit more about how we can invest in people and help restore swagger?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we have to get into more conversations with people, get into uncomfortable conversations with people, lean into the discomfort. I think that being able to move forward without having all of the answers is a skill set right now. We are not going to be able to work on these kinds of projects without the minds that we had before. So you're going to have to learn some new skills. There's a lot of uncertainty that we have to lean into. And I think that we just got to throw comfort out the window. If I go into like a racial dialogue and I come out smiling and it wasn't uncomfortable at all, then I don't think it went deep enough. Like I'm looking for the challenge so that we can address it and grow and expand. I feel like if everybody's comfortable in a conversation, nothing was really learned.
And then from those uncomfortable conversations, how does that influence the design process? Patty Boyle wants to know, like, how do we amplify swagger beyond those conversations through the design process?
Well, I think that depends on what you're designing. It's a question that's going to be tailored to whatever the project is and what level of control you have to apply what you've heard from citizen planners. I feel like we can only do so much as practitioners. So in so much as we can be amplifying others' voices, it depends like where we are in the conversation. What I'm realizing is on these projects, I usually get hired in doing community engagement. So even my own voice, like I'm a planner too, like I'm vice chair of city planning commission, but I get left out of the planning conversations because I was invited in to do engagement. So sometimes I'm off to the corner until it's time to have a public meeting. And I'm like, I don't know what you've been talking about. So I can't have a good conversation with citizens if I haven't been in the planning conversation. So I know that if it's hard for me as a paid practitioner to have a voice in there, I know it's super hard to leverage a resident's voice in the conversation. It all depends on where you are in the hierarchy on your team.
And Sandra brings up a good point. She says that other ethnic backgrounds are celebrated: Chinatown, Banglatown, Arab communities, and many more. Why not Black communities?
Because they scared, Sandra. They scared. Sometimes I really do believe that people might be afraid of what Black magic looks like, to see us in all of our glory. I don't know. I really do think that's a fear that some people have. Again, it's that zero sum thing. People think if Black people come up, then white folks gotta descend. That isn't the case, you know. But I think that some people have that kind of fear. If we really shine, then it somehow diminishes other people's glow, and that doesn't have to be the case. But I do think it's a fear-based proposition that keeps us from having a Black town or an African American town.
And the questions keep coming in. So Laura Walker, it's a good topic, Laura. Do you have a story where you were able to influence a developer or a designer to understand and recognize the value in addressing Black cultural needs to where they were excited to invest beyond the initial project scope?
Ooh, no. I'll say,
What does that mean then?
I will say not yet. Like a lot of this is new for me. Like these past few months, I've just been in the lab, like thinking, reading, researching, contemplating. Like a lot of what I presented is stuff I just came up with over the past couple months. So I haven't had a chance to necessarily apply it. I'm just kind of, materializing things that I've seen and witnessed and experienced into like a new approach. So I haven't even gotten to apply all of it yet. So no, I have not seen that yet. But I also think it's a new moment. Post George Floyd planning is very different than pre. So I feel like we have yet to see those things, but I think they're on the horizon for sure.
And from Janet, we know that Black Bottom can never, ever be replaced as it once was. Time has passed, and we have today's neighborhoods where Black culture and swagger can be seen if we learn to look. How do we recalibrate our approach to make sure these places don't go through the same ever again?
Ooh, well, there's a multi-pronged approach. I feel like city governments have a role, planning commissions and appointees have a role. but also practitioners. But I think it starts with changing how we think about these things. We have to have a critical mass of people who is thinking differently, who is asking the critical questions in order to drive a change. And I don't think it can happen from just one sector. You know, it's a multi-pronged approach, but it starts with giving people information in a way that helps them to critically question.
And Kendall would like to jump back to the culture versus commerce slide. How do we influence someone who is primarily interested in their return on investment into using their space for something that is more culturally driven?
Well, I think that the culture conversation is not a culture or commerce. I think that if you focus on the culture, you will get to the right commercial application. Like if you can find out what people really need, what people's values are, how people communicate, what their desires, hopes, and dreams are. If you can address what their culture is, you can figure out what the commercial application is. But the way we do it now, we just start at commercial. You have to start with culture and you will get to the right cultural application. And you'll get things that last. I almost put a slide in the presentation today about Will Leather Goods. So it was celebrated as this, wow, look, we got this fancy leather store in Midtown. And everybody was like, ooh, I remember being like toured through it. It was like a, you know, this magnificent creation in our Midtown. Like this is what all the things should be. And it closed 4 years later because nobody in that neighborhood could afford that stuff. Nobody was buying those $250 leather, handmade leather handbags. And it's not that like fine quality leather goods are bad, but it didn't speak to the culture of the folks in that community at that time. Yeah, we just have to be thinking more about what speaks to where people are at in a moment in time.
So what was a successful outcome of a planning project that you were involved in? And what do you view as a success and how that might be different from the expected outcome?
Well, like I said, I think I highlighted in one of my slides platforms for relationships to be had where they weren't in the past. I think that is I look at that as like a successful legacy. If I acted as kind of a liaison between some folks in power and some folks who needed power, and created a way for them to stay in communication, I think I did something good. I'm always looking at the people outcomes. I'm not looking at like, oh, I left a rehab commercial storefront or an activated lot. I think it's the outcomes in my mind that are successful are always going to be people outcomes. And I know that there are a lot more people that are civically engaged now than before my interaction on the Northwest side. If you can just, you know, give people information. I was always big on telling people like, this is how planning processes work. These are who the key players are. We always want to get in front of people and give them limited information and then ask for input. I'm like, but we haven't told people the whole story. Let's explain what's actually going on, how much money we actually have, who are actually the decision makers, instead of doing all this performative stuff about how people can participate when they really don't have agency in a certain decision. So just giving people the right amount of information got people super activated. So I would say creating platforms for people to stay engaged with people in power, and then getting people off the sidelines and into the civic arena are things I think of as successes.
And from Nahaya.
Hey, Nahaya.
Nahaya wants to talk about gentrification.
Of course she does.
So we want the investment and we want to have economically and racial diverse neighborhoods. Where do we start when we are so monoculture now? And do we want racially diverse neighborhoods? And I think that this will then flow into the question that we got submitted earlier about someone who is interested in living in Detroit as a white person, but wants to approach the community in a non-gentrification version of creating a diverse income and diverse identity in a neighborhood.
See, now that's a lot of words.
How do we start?
I can't remember the original question.
So yeah, the original, let's start with, we want the investment, to have economically and racial diverse neighborhoods. So where do we start when we are so monoculture now?
What do you mean monoculture? I feel like we have.
Nahaya, I'm gonna ask to unmute you so you can explain that.
It's not every neighborhood, but I would say there are neighborhoods that have a majority Black people. There are neighborhoods that have a majority white people right now. And we don't have a lot of neighborhoods that are truly diverse right now. There's some, and there's like blocks, but I would say it's more the exception than the norm currently. So that's what I mean by monocultures.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought you meant like melting pot, like there's no real culture. There's this thing.
No.
I'm just saying like segregated.
Yeah,
Like,
more segregated,
okay.
siloed. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a tough one. You know, we've always scored high in that ranking of most segregated metros. And I think it's because we haven't reckoned with our history. What about that? We have not had a real ass conversation about what happened to the people in Black Bottom and their descendants. We have not had a real ass conversation about 67. Something else I internalized about 67, that it was Black people's fault. I think my mom, in an abbreviated way, were like, oh yeah, Black people went nuts one day and tore up the city. So that's what I internalized about it. And I didn't understand that there were all these pre-existing conditions that we were responding to. So I feel like a true reckoning with our racial history could get us to a place where we could live together. But we got to be able to have a super honest conversation about what happened and who's at fault, and then what we are owed. I think Black folks are owed something for that negative racial history.
And to follow up with Nahaya, second question is, do we want racially diverse neighborhoods?
I do. I think, well, see, I don't know. I might be
how do we have racially diverse neighborhoods without gentrification?
Well, I mean, that's entirely possible. You can, as a white person, enter a neighborhood on the humble and not come in and want to make everything in your reflection. You know, you can come into a place and be like, oh, you got cool stuff going on here. Can I hang out? You know, versus like, oh, I can't believe how you people are living, you know, which is usually the mantra. But I think, yeah, you can enter a neighborhood humbly and you should have a good time. But I also think that, yes, people want diverse communities. I got socialized around a lot of white people in my youth. So I think that for me, being in mixed communities is comfortable, but for some Black folks, it's not. And I get it. And I think it has to do with the power dynamic. It has to do with who is benefiting from all the new things that are happening in the city right now. So you see, if you are a Black person who is struggling, and you know, not by your own fault, and you see some white folks that just got here who are just magically thriving, and all this opportunity is thrown at them, there's a there's a dynamic that exists when you try to be in relationship with those folks that we need to address. Again, at the core is those relationships.
I have a couple of friends who have told me who have moved into Detroit neighborhoods who have said that walking their dog is the best way to meet their neighbors. So I think it's just about getting out there and getting to know the folks that you live next to, right?
And like I said, you got to know the history. Understand that if somebody is having a reaction to you, it's because you resemble the oppressor. It is not necessarily because of something you did or what they think about you. It is still folks trying to grapple with our racial history. So really, it has nothing to do with you, and you can't take that personally. Just be willing to hold that space for somebody to be uncomfortable with you at first. They have every right to be, because the stuff is fucked up.
So a good question from Rachel is, in our effort to restore swagger in Black communities, many people will often come back to the commerce over culture. It seems counterintuitive to ask someone to quote unquote measure spirit or swagger. But have you found effective ways to measure these elements to put their importance at a higher priority?
Ooh, no. But I think we do need to be thinking about new ways to evaluate our work. I know that, you know, usually a grant report is like, how many people came to your event? It's not like, did people feel like their voices were heard? Like we need to ask qualitative questions instead of quantitative. Like 100 people could have come to my thing, but I could have talked the whole time and not let anybody get a word in edgewise. So I think that we have to change how we evaluate and how we think about evaluations, and we need to do them over time. I would like to see philanthropy be like, okay, I'm not going to ask you how you did spending the grant money. I'm going to ask people in the community you work in how you did at spending this grant money. Like that would be some genuine feedback. Like, of course, I'm going to tell you I did a great job spending that grant, but like the people that I'm serving, what are they going to say? That would be a true test of how the money is spent.
So, what methods do you recommend in holding ourselves accountable to implementing this design thinking on a project?
I think you just ask Black people. So if we're just talking about AfroUrbanism here, ask the Black folks you're working with, hey, am I making room for you to show up whole? Is your culture reflected in this project? You just got to ask people.
And so while we're waiting on more questions through the chat, I'll return to some of the ones that were submitted before this evening. So one individual asked that while they didn't want to distract from the focus on Black communities, they hoped to learn some principles that they can apply to the historically disadvantaged community in the area where they currently work, namely Alaska Natives.
Yeah.
And so they're hoping that this is not appropriated,
No.
but would like you to address the applicability to other cultural groups affected by colonialism.
Well, what I've learned from doing race work is sometimes you have to be explicit. So I try to just always say Black. I'm always tempted to say communities of color or other marginalized groups. But to be honest with you, I think in terms of a cultural karma, nothing we do in America will be right until we do right by the Native Americans. I feel like what we did to Native Americans is kind of the original sin. What I always think of is that scene in The Color Purple where Celie is like, until you do right by me, everything you think about gonna crumble. And I think that is the Native Americans talking to the United States. I really don't think anything we do is going to be stable till we address that original sin. I don't know what that looks like. And I'm kind of embarrassed to say, as this person who's been working in racial equity, like my knowledge of what Native Americans go through is real small. But I will say it seems kind of performative that everybody's doing land acknowledgements all of a sudden. I don't think that that is exactly where this needs to go. I see the look on some people's faces, you know. So a land acknowledgement is when you say, like Detroit is where the Anishinaabe people were. See, I can't even say it. I need to know this, but it's when you acknowledge the land that we're really on. Like this isn't really Detroit. It's like Waiotong. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but it's really, as a Native American province, it should not be recognized as Detroit. And there were tribes of people that were here before the colonists came. So there are lots of organizations that are now starting every Zoom call or every conference, like we'd like to do a Native American land acknowledgement. And I don't know, it seems performative. And I don't know that it really would do what it's intended to do. But I do think that, yeah, nothing we do here matters until we address our original sin. And I don't know how we do that, but we need to.
And I'm getting a question from someone who I think just needs a little bit of reassurance. How does a white designer address communities who have been promised much and received so little so that they trust enough to even engage in the process in the first place?
Well, you just have to be willing to put in the time. You know, to build real trust with people takes time. And it takes more than like the 3 community meetings that are required as part of your RFP. Like, can you engage with people outside what is required on your piece of paper? Can you create other opportunities to be in conversation with people? I really hate that the scope exists sometimes because I'll be like, oh, we should set up some office hour opportunities to have casual conversations with people, but it's not in the scope. We only have to do these 3 meetings. But sometimes what is required is beyond what's on the piece of paper. So you got to be willing to talk to people offline. Can you have a phone conversation with somebody that happens outside of that meeting? Like whatever it takes to meet people where they're at to build the trust. But it's definitely going to be more than whatever the required number of town halls is. That is no longer an acceptable way to engage people. We need to stop pretending like it is.
Well, it seems like we're getting some disagreement through the chat. We have a comment from one attendee who says that they feel like Detroit is more diverse than many other cities. When you go to restaurants and events in Detroit, it's often mixed racially. And another attendee replied that they disagree, that going to a restaurant or an event in downtown Detroit is different than being in a neighborhood that isn't close to downtown. What are your thoughts on that, Lauren?
Interesting. So Michael Kors is the same and it's not diverse. That could be true. But what's interesting is Detroit is like 80% Black. Like that, I don't know, those numbers don't really make it diverse, but it's a lot of white people in the restaurants downtown. How is this possible? Like there's something else at play here when it's an 80% Black city and I can go to a restaurant. I live in Midtown, I'm bougie. If I went to a restaurant like a couple blocks away, I might see 1 or 2 Black people in it. Like what is that? I kind of know what it is, but then, okay, wait. And Kendall was saying going to a restaurant exactly downtown is different than going to something in a neighborhood. If you really want some flavor, you have to go to something that's like in a neighborhood that isn't downtown or midtown. But sometimes those things are hard to navigate. You can't Google like neighborhood hotspots and get to the thing that's really real. You kind of have to know somebody in these places to know what the thing is to go to. And again, it's about relationships and taking the time to get to know people.
Well, speaking of time, Janet commented that she helped staff a table at a community gathering with the neighborhood's Maggie. 6 hours, they talked nonstop about everything. So, Lauren, do you feel that there's a need to remind people that they need to be willing to spend more time, something more than the 3 required meetings in the RFP?
Absolutely. I mean, do you want transformational outcomes or do you want 3 meeting outcomes? It's just about what kind of work do you want to do? You know, there's an outcome you can get with 3 meetings. Or you can do something that is really transformational and meet people where they're at when they need to be met. I hate town hall meetings. Part of the reason that I always propose additional methods of engagement because I'm so bored with town halls. Jesus. But in the way that some of the technicians on the team present information, it's highly technical because they're technicians. And I'm always fighting with them like that has too many layers. That key for the map has like 20 things in it. Nobody can read that in a short amount of time. There's just, it doesn't surprise me that certain people don't show up to town halls because of the way we present information and just the format. It's a drag. So I don't even want to go. And if I, as a practitioner, don't want to go to the town hall, I'm always thinking of what are the other ways that we can engage people. Like, can you have a dinner and dialogue? Can you get people together for some food and just have a casual conversation about the future of the community? And from that, be able to extract things that you can apply to the project or the design. There are just other ways to do things than that standard boring ass meeting.
Bradford would like to know, how would your process change when working in a city that you're new to?
Interesting. Well, I would immediately look for, I guess liaison is a satisfactory word, but I would want somebody that's already on the ground doing the work. And I would want to make sure that there's nobody locally that could do what I'm doing. I really feel a certain kind of way taking up space when there may be people locally that can do the work. Like this project I'm working on the east side, I have a colleague doing the engagement with me and I usually let him do all the talking because he's from the neighborhood. I just feel like you should have a representative face, someone who's familiar, like talking to people. So although I would love to like boost my consultant repertoire and get some out of town work, I am approaching that, with a little bit of trepidation because I'm not from these other places. And I feel like there's just some embodied knowledge that I wouldn't have when trying to do work in another place. And I'd want to make sure that I met the right people that could tell me what I need to know.
And so, for those that are not necessarily experts in Afro-urbanism or engaging their local community in Detroit, there are quite a few organizations that exist within and around the city of Detroit with the sole purpose of improving the life of the residents that live here. What are the best ways that people can get involved in the various organizations to help make the biggest impact possible, moving the needle towards a just and equitable future for those communities?
You know, if I'm being honest, I don't even know if you should reach out to existing organizations. The way our ecosystem works, I feel like organizations are really confined in what they can do. So they might have a vision of change for how they get to the desired state, but because of the way the funding is laid out, they have to kind of contort themselves. So I feel like a lot of organizations are really, not doing the work the way that they really want to do it. So I would say, in lieu of talking to an organization, go meet the Bryces of the neighborhood, go meet the Maggie Lees of the neighborhood, go meet the Halima of the neighborhood, and see if you can get involved with what they're doing. I feel like the real change at this moment is going to come from outside the system. And I think it'll be led by artists. Kind of came to me one day. I was like everybody's so afraid to offend philanthropy. So we're trying to fit what we do into what they want. And I'm like, who doesn't have a boss? Who is not trying to please anybody? And I was like, oh, artists. Like, the artist really only answers to the muse, right? You don't really have a boss. Nobody's telling you don't paint that way, don't sculpt that way. So how might we, bring more artists into the work of community development, because their imaginations are more boundless. I feel very confined working in this nonprofit community development ecosystem. There's so many guardrails. We all have to color in these lines, but these lines have not been drawn appropriately.
Lauren, through some of your examples, you talked about projects that you were involved in that probably don't meet your standards today. So how has this approach to working changed you as a designer and a planner? And what sort of changes do you expect to see develop further in your work with the community as an Afro-urbanist?
Well, I'm certainly feeling more liberated. I have to admit, again, this community development ecosystem we're in, it feels like sometimes we're afraid to say Black, even though we're in a mostly Black city, with lots of Black folks in what seem to be leadership positions. So lots of us are directors, but then there's a board that may be behind the scenes kind of guiding what you can and can't do and should and shouldn't say. So I think that for me right now, this is a moment to be extra bold, try things that are totally new. I kind of feel like I have nothing to lose. To be honest, like, after I was relieved of my position leading that community development nonprofit, I internalized that I had done something wrong. I carried a lot of shame around focusing so much on community development and not the real estate development that the board and the funder wanted me to focus on. And I was like, well, maybe my approach was wrong. Maybe my idea that I wasn't supposed to do that. And it took me a long time to be like, that's some bullshit. Just the way the system works is the wrong thing. And people are the answer, and people should be the priority. So for me, having gone through that process and experienced the shame and going within, I feel like now I'm like, who cares? I have nothing to lose. So I'm being all the way bold. I'm like, Afro-urbanism, fuck you, it's Black, deal with it, And I might not have said that 6 months ago, but now I feel like, yep, it works.
So Lauren, when you stepped away from that nonprofit, you were able to be a little bit more free in your expression and the way that you approached community activism and engagement. What about for the individuals who might be working at firms, or whether small or large, where they might be under leadership that might not be on board with this approach to community engagement when it comes to urban projects in a city, whether it's this urban environment or the next. How does designer lower on the totem pole in an architectural firm with a lot of potentially bureaucratic tape to cut through influence the leadership at that firm and the decision makers?
Well, I think that you can influence upward. We are seriously in a moment where if you can't adapt to these new ways of thinking, I don't think you're going to get the projects. You're not going to get the clients because people want stuff that is culturally appropriate, culturally competent. They want projects that are transformative. And I think that this old way of thinking isn't going to get you there. So I think the best thing you can do is advocate upward and make the case that the world is different now. And if you don't respond to the new consciousness that everybody's occupying, then you won't get the work. And I totally believe that to be true. Why would you hire somebody that's operating on an old OS? If you're operating on the pre-George Floyd OS, like, I'm not gonna hire you.
Okay, I'm laughing at that comment. That was great.
OS.
Well, I've sort of run out of questions to refer to. Does anyone else have any questions from the audience that's still with us? If you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you.
Thanks for sticking around. It looks like 77 people are still here. That's awesome.
Yeah, well, it's a really engaging conversation, and I think, oh, we did just get a question. So, you know, a lot of the conversation has evolved more generally around planning and general issues. So, it would be interesting to hear your opinion of an architect's responsibility working for a private client with no budget for community engagement. Because I'm assuming a lot of these people on this call have experienced that.
I know, I was thinking about that. I'm like, oh, it's AIA, they're all architects. Really, what capacity do they have, like, on a design team to really make the big difference? I don't know. I would advocate for going back to whoever the sponsor is and asking for some engagement funds. I've done that recently and got some funds. You know, you really need to be able to make the case that your outputs aren't going to speak to the people that it's really for if you can't engage them properly. So I would make the case that you need to get the funds, or be willing to do some stuff that you're not getting paid for. So I am severely under my usual budget on this East Side project that I'm working on, but I thought it was an important project to do. It's like the last neighborhood of the strategic neighborhood funds planning process. When I ran the community development nonprofit, we were engaged with one of the first of the 10 neighborhood plans. So I want to know how the city is improving or not improving at their engagement practices, and what the funder, Invest Detroit, like, how are they now thinking about community engagement? So I thought it was an important project to do, but I'm making like 1/3 of what I normally get paid. And there's a lot of extra engagement that we do that we didn't budget for, but we knew was important. So we started doing these, we started doing regular weekly office hours. So we were meeting in Zoom every week. It scaled down to every other week, but we get a consistent crew of like 30 or 40 people to show up. And I really feel like because of what happened with COVID and because of quarantine, like, it's kind of a comforting place for folks at some point. Like, when else can you go to a Zoom and see like 30 other people that live in your neighborhood? Like you can on our planning process. So I really think that this, you know, these extra opportunities that we've made ourselves available for engagement have paid off for people in other ways. And me and my friend Joe, who are doing the engagement, like, we're getting severely less than we do on our other projects, but we both thought it was really important work to do.
And a question from Richard asking, how would you charge the community benefits ordinance?
That is a tough one. I feel like we need some new language. So people in power, elected officials, the administration have negative opinions of community benefits ordinances. So I think we just got to call it something else moving forward. Like, still be advocating for the same things, but people are going to have a certain kind of reaction and immediately shut down the conversation if you say community benefits. So I don't know how we need to be talking about it, but it's got to change because it'll get shut down instantly. A developer will, elected officials will. We got to talk about it differently. I see Michael has his hand up.
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah. So 25 years ago, we did a project in Chicago with SOM in a neighborhood, and a community development project, and we did the public engagement, and it was actually one of the first projects that SOM did like that, which is part of why we've been working with them since on projects in Detroit. But one of the things that it taught us way back then was that in Chicago, they had the alderman system. And the alderman, you could not do anything in a neighborhood without the alderman's engagement. And at that time, we literally started thinking, well, Detroit needs a representational council. And we started talking about that. And now we have that. And rather than the council actually representing their districts, they've put this, this community, thing back in. And it's like, where's the council? I personally think they should get rid of this, because they had this when it was a non-representational council. They put this design council in place, and they don't have any legs. So I really feel like the city council should be the one that is driving the community engagement for a project, whatever projects are in their neighborhoods, because they're accountable. And they should actually be accountable to the people in their neighborhoods for what goes on in their neighborhoods, like the aldermen have always done in Chicago.
That's a good reflection. Yeah, somebody needs to be accountable. That's the only way to make people get something done, if people know who to blame and who to shame.
Right. So the community, the community benefits ordinance, it's just, sorry, the council should be doing that. That's who should be doing that. That would make it better.
So in relation to other politics, someone asked about proposal N, and someone needs to explain what proposal N is for those that don't live in Detroit, and then wanted to know your thoughts on it, Lauren. First of all, if there's anyone who's willing to speak to proposal N other than Lauren, please raise your hand right now.
The blight bond, but yeah, Sandra, I saw Sandra raise her hand. Yeah, I'm not gonna get myself in trouble. So go ahead.
Okay, Sandra, go ahead. All right, what we can do, Sandra, if you want to try and type.
Oh, Devin said he'll do it.
Devin? Okay.
I haven't seen Devin in a minute. Where's Devin?
All right, here we go, Devin.
Hey, I'll try to navigate this minefield. Sorry, everybody. At its heart, I think Proposal N is the second pass at a kindler, gentler blight bond that aims to also preserve as well as demolish housing in the city of Detroit. There was a proposal previously that the mayor supported that was more demo focused that failed. So this is sort of coming back to the table with a compromise is kind of how I look at it. And yes, it's imperfect. Yes, it's probably not far enough, but like at least they're back at the table with a second try is sort of how I've looked at it.
Thanks, Devin. Sure. I would say my questions were, I have to give a shout out to Kat Stafford, who wrote an article about how the demolitions were poisoning the children. We hadn't really taken concessions for figuring out what doing demolitions at scale would do to the environment and the air quality. So that had some impact on my thinking about it, but Google Kat Stafford's article on that bond.
So Devin, I'm going to unmute you again, just so you can read your comment to everyone, because I think that it's a relevant topic for the architects on the call.
Sure. Sorry about that. It's tied into something that I think about with sustainability all the time, which is that we're building buildings that in 10 years we're going to look back on and think we have to tear down because they're so underperforming environmentally. I think about it a lot like hotels in 1910, 1912, where they were building all these hotels that 10 years later weren't going to have the amenities that people wanted, like the original Pontchartrain. That was this massive edifice that lasted like 15 years. And I think that some of this has to do with what we're talking about today as well. It's not just sustainability, but that architects advocate to their clients based on their understanding of their clients' best interests all the time, whether that's community engagement, carbon or energy efficiency, the perennial fight in Detroit to exceed minimum code standards, which was almost a comment I made by itself, where all these developers come to town and they're like, what does code make me do? I just want to do that. What does the zoning ordinance make me do? I just want to do that. And a lot of the architect's job, especially lately, especially in the world we live in, post George Floyd and post
COVID.
sorry, I was trying to think of climate change. Like in this climate change world we're in, advocacy as part of the standard of care is almost a given. Now, developers just turn to us and say no all the time just as well, but like you have to have the conversation.
So in instances when architects are simply told no, Lauren, what are your suggestions? Because architects they have to always balance their will and their designs and a paycheck, right? So
yeah, it's tough though. I'm always just asking myself, like, what kind of human do I want to be? But I also recognize, like, I don't have any kids right now, and I don't have a mortgage, so I can make statements like, "Screw you, boss man," and and just I can lose a consultant contract and be fine because no one's counting on me to take care of them at the moment. And I recognize that not everybody can do that. If you got a family, you really have to worry about your job, and you can't be making those high and mighty kind of calls like about people you won't work with because they're not ethical enough. So that's tricky. I don't know. I think you have to do a cost benefit analysis. What is at stake if you speak up? Are you in a position where you can take some risk? But again, I would say we can use this moment as a weapon, to do super righteous things. There are things going on across the world that you can point to and be like, do you see what's happening? We have some tools at our disposal that we haven't always had.
And Patty makes a good point in the comments that architects can participate in the code development process. We know that the Americans with Disability Act turned 30 this year. And if we can put into code standards that are non-negotiable for physical accessibility, then why can't we do so for racial equality?
I've been thinking about that. Like, how can we put codify racial equity? What does that look like? Who should be working on that? Is that a charter commission thing? I don't know. I've been thinking about what levers need to be pulled to make that happen.
Well, on that topic, while I see a couple people potentially typing more questions, recently recommended by Imani Day to the AIA Detroit board is Crip Camp on Netflix, CRIP space CAMP. It's about the originations of the ADA in the civil rights movement and the amount of protesting and civil disobedience it took to get it passed and finally into law. And so if you have Netflix and you have at 90 minutes, it's an incredible piece that I would recommend everybody to watch.
I've also been thinking about LEED certification. So what if, I don't know if people find that valuable at all, but if it's attractive for a person or a project to get LEED certification, what would some kind of racial equity certification start to look like? Would people voluntarily do that? Would it have value?
Well, I think that we have run out of questions for this evening. Just a lot of comments that this presentation and the complex issues of racial justice, this was a great discussion and great insights. Thank you for those comments. There are other LEAD type systems with specific racial equity components. Yeah, so thumbs up, applause. Thank you, Lauren, for leading this discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you for everyone who held on till 7:30. Phenomenal discussion. If you guys want to keep battling it out in the comments, that's fine. I'll stay on for a few more minutes. Otherwise, we really appreciate you all sticking with us. And of course, Lauren, thank you so much for sharing your honest opinions and methods. And hopefully this will seed inspiration in everyone who attended tonight to do better with their community engagement and their planning and their projects going forward.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much again. Everybody have a fantastic evening, rest of your evening, and be on the lookout for more programming from AIA Detroit on relevant issues that are impacting our urban environments today.